I spent 40 years of my life building a business from nothing. I did it so my family would never have to experience the cold, desperate hunger that I grew up with in the rural outskirts of Ohio. When you spend decades breathing in fiberglass insulation, hauling heavy copper pipes in 95-degree heat, and freezing on commercial rooftops in the middle of January, you develop a certain perspective on money. It is not just numbers on a screen. It represents sweat, skin, and time that you can never buy back. I built Crawford Commercial HVAC from a single rusted Ford Econoline van into a $40 million enterprise. My late wife, Diane, was right there with me from the very start. She was the one who kept the books on our kitchen table while I worked 90-hour weeks. She was my anchor, my partner, and the only person in the world who truly understood the price of our success. Now Diane was gone. She passed away 3 years ago, leaving a void in my life that no amount of money could ever fill. The house we had shared in Upper Arlington, a large brick home that we bought after our first profitable decade, felt more like a museum than a home now. It was filled with her paintings, her furniture, and the memories of the holidays we shared. Without her, the silence in those large rooms was deafening. I spent my days maintaining my old tools and trying to find ways to occupy my time, but the grief remained a heavy weight in my chest. It was a freezing Tuesday evening in November, and the wind in downtown Columbus was sharp enough to slice through a wool coat. I had gathered my 35-year-old son, Zachary, and his 32-year-old wife, Julianne, for dinner at a high-end steakhouse. I was paying, of course. I always paid. The purpose of the dinner was simple, and to me sacred. We were there to mark the 3rd anniversary of Diane's passing. I wanted to spend the evening talking about her, sharing stories, and remembering the woman who had made everything we had possible. But as the night progressed, it became painfully clear that Zachary and Julianne had very different priorities. Zachary had been running the company as chief executive officer for the past year. I had stepped back into the role of chairman, thinking it was time to let the next generation lead. I wanted to give him the space to grow as a leader, believing he had inherited my work ethic. Julianne, a former real estate agent with a taste for flashy designer clothes and expensive country clubs, sat next to him. She was scrolling through her phone, barely pretending to be interested in the conversation, while sipping a $35 glass of imported wine. Zachary looked exhausted, but not in a way that commanded respect. He had the tense, irritable demeanor of a man who was hiding something, his eyes darting around the restaurant. He barely touched his steak, instead focusing on his 3rd glass of expensive scotch. When the main plates were cleared, I decided it was the right moment to share a decision I had made. It was a choice that had brought me some peace during this difficult week of mourning. I reached into the breast pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out my personal checkbook. I set it on the table. "I have been thinking a lot about your mother this week," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "You know how much she loves St. Luke's Community Church. That old building has been struggling with a failing roof for 5 years now. Diane always wanted to fix it for them, so, to honor her memory, I am going to write a check for $50,000 from my personal savings account to cover the cost of a complete replacement." I expected a nod of agreement, or perhaps a shared moment of remembrance. Instead, the reaction was immediate and explosive. Zachary snatched his heavy glass of scotch and slammed it down onto the table with such force that the crystal shattered. The loud crack echoed through the quiet dining room. Shards of glass and amber liquid splattered across the white tablecloth, soaking into the fabric. Several patrons at neighboring tables stopped talking and turned to look. Zachary leaned across the table, his face flushed red and his veins bulging against his collar. "Stop wasting my money," Zachary hissed, his voice filled with a venomous rage. "Are you losing your mind? What the hell are you doing writing $50,000 checks to some useless church? That is my money you are throwing away." Julianne winced, but she did not defend me. Instead, she kicked Zachary under the table, whispering at him to quiet down because people were staring. Zachary flinched, but his eyes remained locked on me, burning with hatred. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I sat perfectly still, staring at the absolute stranger sitting across from me. The words echoed in my mind. My money. He had just called my personal savings, the money I had earned through 4 decades of physical labor, his money. I had sacrificed my own health so he would never know the struggle of poverty. I had handed him a thriving company, and in just 12 months his entitlement had mutated into this. He truly believed he owned my life and my wealth. The silence at our table was suffocating. I slowly reached out, picked up my checkbook, and slid it back into my pocket. I did not say a word. I stood up, pulled 2 $100 bills from my wallet, and dropped them onto the wet, glass-covered tablecloth to cover the cost of the meal. I turned my back on my son and his wife, and I walked out of the steakhouse. The freezing winter air hit my face as I pushed through the heavy doors. The wind was howling down the street, but I barely felt the cold. My mind was completely clear. The grief I had carried for 3 years was suddenly replaced by a cold, sharp focus. My son had declared war on me. He had looked at the man who gave him everything and saw nothing but a bank account to be drained. I walked toward my vintage 1978 Ford pickup truck, parked in the back corner of the lot. I climbed into the freezing cab and started the engine. The familiar rumble of the V8 engine did not soothe me tonight. It only reminded me of the decades of hard work that my son was now claiming as his own. As I drove back to my empty house in Upper Arlington, the streetlights cast long, moving shadows across the dashboard. I knew right then that I would not be a victim. I would not allow Zachary and Julianne to tear down what Diane and I had spent our lives building. The battle had begun, and I was going to make sure I was the one who finished it. I woke up at 4:30 the next morning. 4 decades of waking up early to load service trucks, review technical blueprints, and organize installation crews had permanently set my internal clock. The large house was painfully quiet, the air cold and still. I walked down the long carpeted hallway, past the framed photographs of our family trips, and went into the kitchen. I brewed a large pot of strong black coffee and sat at the granite kitchen island. I watched the early morning frost cling to the bare branches of the oak trees in the backyard. My mind was stuck on a loop, replaying the scene from the restaurant. I saw Zachary's face, red with rage, and heard the sharp crack of the shattering glass. I heard his voice shouting that my savings were his money. The coffee tasted like ash in my mouth. I had spent my youth working in the dirt and the heat so that he could grow up in comfort. I had paid for his private schooling, his college tuition, his cars, and his wedding. I had handed him a successful company on a silver platter. Now, he was looking at me as if I were a thief stealing from his inheritance. By 8:00, the winter sun was struggling to break through the thick gray Ohio clouds. That was when the heavy brass knocker on my front door echoed through the quiet house. I was not expecting anyone. I set my coffee mug down, walked across the foyer, and opened the door. Zachary and Julianne were standing on the porch. The cold wind was whipping Julianne's blonde hair across her face. Zachary was holding a large, shrink-wrapped fruit basket with an oversized gold ribbon. He looked terrible. His eyes were bloodshot, and his skin had the pale, damp look of a man who had spent the night drinking too much scotch. Julianne, on the other hand, looked perfectly put together. She wore a tailored cashmere coat and held a pair of expensive leather gloves. She had a bright, forced smile on her face that did not reach her eyes. "Dad," Zachary said, his voice raspy and much quieter than it had been the night before. "Can we come in, please? We really need to talk to you." I stared at them for a long moment. My business instincts, the ones that had guided me through multiple recessions and corporate battles, told me to close the door in their faces. But I knew that a good businessman never closes a door until he knows exactly what the other side is trying to sell. I stepped back, opening the door wide to let them in. They stepped into the warm foyer, bringing the smell of expensive perfume and nervous sweat with them. Zachary handed me the heavy fruit basket. I took it, feeling the ridiculous weight of the shrink-wrapped fruit and cheeses, and carried it into the kitchen. I set it on the counter, leaving the gold ribbon intact. I then led them into the formal sitting area, the room Diane had decorated with so much care. I sat in my usual armchair by the fireplace, which was cold. Zachary and Julianne sat close together on the leather sofa, looking like 2 guilty teenagers called into the principal's office. I did not offer them coffee or water. I simply crossed my hands in my lap and waited. In any negotiation, the first person to speak is usually the one who loses. I had the patience of a stone. Zachary broke first. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and rubbed his face. "Dad, I am so sorry about last night," he began, his voice sounding heavy with forced regret. "My behavior was completely unacceptable. I was out of line, and I deeply regret causing a scene, especially on the anniversary of Mom's passing. I know how important that day is to you." I remained quiet, keeping my face completely blank. I did not nod or offer any words of forgiveness. Zachary swallowed hard, shifting onto the sofa. "It is just the stress, Dad. The pressure of running Crawford Commercial HVAC is wearing me down. We are trying to expand into the Cleveland and Cincinnati markets at the same time, and the supply chain issues are causing massive delays with our industrial rooftop units. I have not slept more than 3 hours a night in weeks. Last night, I drank too much on an empty stomach. When you pulled out the checkbook to give away $50,000, I just snapped. I felt like the weight of the company was crushing me, and I took it out on you. Please believe me, that is not who I am. I did not mean those words. It was a classic excuse. He was blaming the alcohol, the supply chain, and the company I had built for him. He was taking no real responsibility for the greed that had poured out of him." Before I could speak, Julianne reached out and placed a hand on Zachary's knee. She looked at me with a soft, concerned expression. "It is the truth, Dad," she said, her voice dripping with sweet concern. "Zachary has been working himself to death to make you proud. But honestly, we have both been worried about you lately. You have been living alone in this big house for 3 years now. Grief can do strange things to a person's mind." My heart slowed to a cold, steady beat. "Worried about me?" I asked, my voice flat. "Yes," Julianne said quickly. "You are so generous, Dad. Sometimes too generous. We have been reading about these awful scams targeting older, wealthy men who live alone. People who manipulate your grief to get large donations. When you pulled out your checkbook last night to give $50,000 to that church, Zachary panicked. He wants to protect you. He meant to say our family money, not his money. He was just afraid you were being taken advantage of by strangers." She smiled, tilting her head. It was a very clever lie. She was turning my charity into a sign of mental weakness and turning Zachary's rage into an act of love. "That is why we went ahead and set up a family protection trust last week," Julianne added smoothly. "Just to protect your personal assets from scammers. It is a standard safety measure for high net worth individuals of your age." I nodded slowly, letting the hard lines of my face soften. I pretended to accept their apology and their explanation. But inside, my corporate instincts were screaming. A family protection trust set up without my knowledge sounded less like a shield and more like a cage. I smiled and told them I understood, but as soon as they left, I knew I had to find out what they had actually done. After Zachary and Julianne finally left my house, taking their hollow apologies and their expensive fruit basket with them, the silence of my home felt even heavier than before. The air inside the foyer was thick with the lingering scent of Julianne's perfume and the bitter aftertaste of their rehearsed performance. I needed to clear my head. I needed to be somewhere that felt real, somewhere far away from the polished granite kitchen and the suffocating silence of my rooms. I went out to the detached garage and pulled the canvas cover off my vintage 1978 Ford pickup truck. It was the very first vehicle I had ever bought brand new, paid for with cash from my first year of running the HVAC business. It was forest green, meticulously maintained, and completely free of modern touchscreens, GPS tracking devices, or computer chips. Driving it always reminded me of who I really was before the millions of dollars, before the corporate boardrooms, and before the greed had infected my family. It was just a machine of pure steel and combustion, honest and straightforward. I turned the ignition key, and the heavy V8 engine roared to life, filling the garage with the rich smell of exhaust and old leather. I backed the truck out into the freezing Columbus afternoon. The sky was the color of bruised iron, threatening snow. I drove toward the industrial side of town, heading to a small independent mechanic shop owned by a man named Timothy Benson. Tim was a guy who worked with his hands, a man who understood the value of hard labor and honest trade. I had scheduled a simple winter tune-up a few weeks prior. It was nothing major, just new spark plugs, fresh oil, and a quick inspection of the heating core to ensure the old truck was ready for the freezing winter weather. The drive was cold but incredibly grounding. The heavy steering wheel and the manual transmission required my complete focus, allowing me to push Zachary and their family protection trust out of my mind, at least for a little while. I pulled into the gravel lot of Tim's shop, the tires crunching loudly over the frozen stones. Tim wiped his grease-stained hands on a red shop rag and greeted me with a warm, genuine smile. We spent the next hour talking about engines, the incoming winter storms, and the reliable durability of classic American manufacturing. It was a simple, honest interaction. There were no hidden agendas, no calculated words, just two men talking about things that made sense. When the work was finished, Tim walked behind the scratched wooden counter to ring me up. The total came out to exactly $415. It was a trivial amount of money for a man in my financial position. I reached into my thick leather wallet and pulled out my black card. This was a private wealth management card, tied to an account with no preset spending limit, containing a massive reservoir of liquid cash I had accumulated over decades of work. I handed the card to Tim. He took it, nodding at the solid weight of the metal, and swiped it through his payment terminal. We continued talking about local football scores while the machine processed the transaction. A few seconds later, the terminal let out a sharp, harsh beep. Tim frowned, looking down at the screen. He wiped the card strip on his apron and swiped it a second time. The machine beeped again, emitting the same negative sound. Tim looked up at me, an apologetic and embarrassed expression washing over his weathered face. "Matt, I am really sorry," Tim said, keeping his voice low so the other mechanics in the garage would not hear. "The machine is saying the card is declined." I stared at him, completely unable to process the word. Declined. The single word felt like a physical blow. I had millions of dollars sitting in that specific account. It was an account I used strictly for personal expenses, entirely separate from the corporate finances of Crawford Commercial HVAC. I had never, not once in my entire life, had a credit card declined. The sheer impossibility of the situation made my chest tighten. I forced a calm, reassuring smile, masking the sudden spike of anxiety. "It must be a security flag," I told Tim. "Sometimes the bank freezes the card if they suspect fraudulent activity." "Give me just one moment, Tim. I will call my private banker directly and have them clear it up." I stepped outside the garage, pulling my heavy wool coat tight against the freezing wind. I dialed the direct private extension for Lawrence Fletcher, my personal banking manager. Lawrence was a senior executive at the bank who handled my portfolio personally. Normally, he answered on the first ring, greeting me with profound respect. This time, the phone rang 6 times. Finally, there was a click. Lawrence answered, but his voice lacked his usual confident warmth. He sounded hesitant and nervous. "Hello?" "Matt," Lawrence said, his words stumbling over one another. "Lawrence," I said, keeping my voice steady but firm. "I am standing at a mechanic shop, and my primary card was just declined for a $415 charge. I need you to lift whatever security hold is currently blocking my funds." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute and terrifying. I could hear Lawrence swallowing hard, taking a shaky breath. "Matt, I am so sorry," Lawrence finally whispered, his voice trembling. "I cannot lift the hold. I no longer have the legal authorization to allow you access to those funds." The freezing wind whipped across the gravel lot, but the sudden cold I felt inside was infinitely worse. "What are you talking about, Lawrence? It is my account. It is my money." "Matt, please listen to me carefully," Lawrence pleaded, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "First thing this morning, your son Zachary and a team of 3 corporate attorneys walked into my office. They presented a binding court order signed by a local judge. Your accounts have not been flagged for fraud. They have been frozen under a co-conservatorship order. Zachary has been granted temporary emergency control over all your personal finances." A co-conservatorship. I was a perfectly healthy and capable 70-year-old man. My mind was completely sharp. My blood ran cold as the reality slammed into my chest. The apology from this morning was a distraction. The Family Protection Trust was not designed to shield my money from outside scammers. It was a legal weapon designed to strip me of my independence. They had legally locked me out of my own life, and the silent war for my survival had officially begun. I hung up the phone and stood frozen in the biting winter wind. The gravel under my boots felt unsteady, as if the earth had suddenly shifted. A co-conservatorship. The magnitude of that legal maneuver echoed through my mind. Zachary had not just frozen my personal accounts. He had executed a calculated legal strike to strip me of my autonomy. In the eyes of the state of Ohio, I was suddenly a legally incapacitated old man, dependent on the protection of the very son who had imprisoned me. I did not waste time yelling or panic. Panic is a luxury reserved for the unprepared. Instead, I climbed back into the cab of my Ford pickup truck, slammed the heavy metal door, and drove straight toward the downtown business district. My destination was the massive glass and steel headquarters of Crawford Commercial HVAC. I had laid the foundation for that building 20 years ago. I knew every structural beam, every ventilation shaft, and every security protocol. It was a monument to my life of labor. But as the building came into view against the gray sky, it no longer looked like my crowning achievement. It looked like a fortress occupied by a hostile enemy. I parked my truck in the adjacent parking garage, intentionally avoiding my reserved spot near the front entrance. I wanted to enter quietly. I walked through the sliding glass doors and stepped into the lobby. The familiar hum of corporate activity washed over me. Phones were ringing, employees in sharp suits walked briskly across the polished stone, and the low murmur of business deals filled the warm air. Nobody paid attention to the 70-year-old man walking toward the back corridor. I bypassed the main reception desk and headed directly for the private executive elevator bank. This was a secure access point designed exclusively for top management. I reached into my coat pocket and retrieved my founder badge. It was a unique key card that granted me unrestricted access to every floor, secure room, and digital terminal in the corporate network. I held the badge up to the sleek black security scanner. I anticipated the familiar soft green glow and the quiet metallic click of the door unlocking. Instead, the scanner let out a harsh, abrupt beep. A bright red light illuminated the digital panel. The display read "Access denied." I stood there, staring at the red light. I swiped the badge a second time. The machine beeped again, flashing that identical, mocking red warning. "Access denied." The reality of the situation washed over me. Zachary had not just locked me out of my personal bank accounts. He had systematically purged my digital identity from the corporate security mainframe. I was officially a ghost inside the very walls I had paid to construct. My jaw tightened, but I did not create a scene. I took a step back and leaned against the marble wall, blending into the lobby like an ordinary visitor waiting for a scheduled appointment. I watched the flow of employees moving through the security gates. After about 10 minutes, I spotted a young, nervous-looking intern balancing a towering stack of cardboard document boxes and 4 cups of coffee. He was fumbling with his security lanyard, desperately trying to scan his badge while keeping the coffee from spilling. I recognized the opportunity instantly. As the intern managed to trigger the green light, I moved with a speed and precision that belied my 70 years. I stepped directly behind him, slipping smoothly through the sliding security turnstile right before the heavy doors snapped shut. The intern jumped, nearly dropping the boxes, and looked over his shoulder. I offered him a calm, reassuring smile, projecting the absolute authority of a man who belonged exactly where he was standing. "Do not worry about it, son," I said, reaching out to steady the top box. "I left my badge up on the top floor. Just hit the button for the executive suite for me, would you?" The young man nodded, his hands shaking as he pressed the glowing button for the top floor. He had no idea he was helping an unauthorized intruder. The elevator ascended smoothly, carrying me upward into the heart of the occupied territory. The doors slid open with a soft chime. I stepped off the elevator and walked silently down the carpeted hallway of the executive floor. The walls were lined with framed photographs of our major industrial projects. I moved like a shadow, making no sound. I bypassed the main boardroom and headed straight toward the corner suite that used to belong to my chief financial officer. As I approached the heavy glass door, I stopped. I peered through the slightly parted blinds. Julianne was sitting behind the massive mahogany desk. She held no official title in my company. She had no business degree and zero corporate experience. Yet, she was casually leaning back in the expensive leather chair, sipping sparkling water. I noticed her left wrist immediately. She was wearing a brand new diamond-encrusted Cartier watch that easily cost $15,000. But the jewelry was not the most shocking detail. Spread across the desk were several thick stacks of legal documents. I recognized the distinctive watermarks. She was holding a heavy gold pen, signing real estate transfer deeds printed directly on my company's official letterhead. She was actively liquidating Crawford commercial property assets. They were quietly dismantling my entire corporate infrastructure, converting brick and steel into liquid cash without any board oversight. She was selling off the physical warehouses and distribution centers I had purchased decades ago, likely funneling the profits into whatever offshore accounts they had secretly established. My chest burned with rage, but my mind remained perfectly cold. I did not push the door open. I did not storm into the office to confront her. Confrontation without leverage is just noise, and I required absolute leverage. I memorized the scene, turned around, and walked silently back down the carpeted hallway. The silent, catastrophic war for my survival had officially begun. I stood by the window, watching the cold snow drift down over the frozen asphalt, remembering how Diane and I used to dream of a quiet life. I got into my Ford truck and merged onto the interstate, heading far away from the polished glass and steel of the downtown headquarters. A light snow had started to fall, coating the cold gray roads. I knew better than to contact the corporate legal department at Crawford Commercial HVAC. Those lawyers were technically on my payroll, but their daily checks were now signed by Zachary. I needed someone whose loyalty belonged exclusively to me. I needed a man who understood the dirty, brutal reality of corporate warfare and possessed the stomach to fight back. I drove 20 miles outside the city limits to a neon-lit diner, sitting alone on a desolate stretch of highway. It was the kind of place where tired truck drivers drank burnt coffee and nobody asked questions. I parked around the back and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of old cooking grease and cheap bacon. Sitting in the back corner booth, nursing a black coffee, was Daniel Miller. Daniel was my retired corporate attorney. He had aggressively defended my company against frivolous lawsuits and hostile takeover attempts for over 30 years before retiring to a quiet life of fishing and bourbon. He possessed a brilliant legal mind and an absolute absence of hesitation when protecting his clients. I slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from him. He took a sip of his coffee and studied my face. "You look like a man who just watched his own funeral," Daniel said, his voice gravelly and low. I laid out the entire timeline with surgical precision. I told him about the anniversary dinner, the shattered crystal glass, and the rage in Zachary's eyes when he screamed about his money. I detailed the fake apology the next morning, the fruit basket, and Julianne's smooth lie about setting up a family protection trust to shield me from elder fraud. I explained the declined card at Tim's shop, the terrified bank manager, and the sudden reality of the court-ordered co-conservatorship. Finally, I told him about the flashing red light at the executive elevator. I described sneaking up to the top floor and watching Julianne, a woman with zero official corporate authority, signing commercial real estate transfer deeds on my company letterhead, actively liquidating our downtown supply warehouses. Daniel set his ceramic coffee mug down. He did not look shocked. He looked deeply analytical. "A conservatorship," Daniel murmured, shaking his head. "That is the nuclear option, Matt. They did not just temporarily lock your checking accounts. They successfully convinced a presiding judge that you are mentally incapacitated. They essentially declared that you are no longer a functioning adult capable of managing your own affairs. It takes extensive documentation to pull a stunt like that off. They would need a licensed medical professional to sign an affidavit confirming your cognitive decline. They have been planning this coup for months. I need to know exactly how deep this goes," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline pounding in my chest. "I need to know what they have stolen." Daniel did not hesitate. He reached into his worn leather briefcase and pulled out a laptop. He flipped it open on the sticky diner table, ignoring the waitress who walked by to top off his mug. He connected to a secure, encrypted mobile hotspot and began typing. The rapid clacking of the keyboard was the only sound between us for several minutes. Daniel was bypassing the standard public search engines, digging directly into the county public records and restricted state judicial databases. I watched the reflection of the glowing screen against his glasses. His jaw tightened. "The Family Protection Trust is a real entity," Daniel said, his eyes scanning the legal text on his monitor. "But it is not a protective shield, Matt. It is a financial vacuum. They structured it as an irrevocable trust, naming Zachary as the primary trustee and Julianne as the secondary. They have already funneled the vast majority of your liquid personal assets into it. The conservatorship gave them the authority and money to move your money without requiring your signature. You are completely locked out of your life savings. But those commercial real estate transfers you saw Julianne signing," Daniel continued, "that is what worries me the most. They are rapidly liquidating your commercial properties to generate massive amounts of cash." Daniel fell silent again, his fingers flying across the keys as he shifted his search. He opened a new tab, pulling up the secure county property tax assessments and residential deed records. He typed in the address of my estate in Upper Arlington, the beautiful brick home where Diane and I had raised our family, the home I had completely paid off 20 years ago. The digital loading icon spun in a circle for what felt like an eternity. Finally, the page populated with a block of official text. Daniel stopped typing. He took a slow, heavy breath and looked directly up at me. His expression was grimmer than I had ever seen it in our 30-year relationship. "Matt," he said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made my stomach drop, "I need you to brace yourself." Daniel turned the laptop around and slid it across the table. I looked down at the screen. There, in stark black and white digital text, was the official deed to my Upper Arlington estate. But my name was completely gone. In its place, listed as the sole owners of the property, were Zachary and Julianne Vance. The date of the transfer was stamped at the bottom. It had been executed 3 weeks ago. My signature had been entirely forged. My blood ran cold. The chilling reality of my situation crystallized. I had not just lost my company or my bank accounts. I had lost my only physical sanctuary. If I went back to that house right now and confronted them, they could legally call the police and have me arrested for trespassing in what used to be my own home. I stood by the window, watching the cold snow drift down over the frozen asphalt, remembering how Diane and I used to dream of a quiet life. I sat in the diner booth staring at the digital deed on Daniel's laptop. My signature, a handwritten mark I had penned thousands of times on payroll checks, corporate contracts, and purchase orders, was perfectly copied at the bottom of the page. It looked exactly like my handwriting, yet I knew with absolute certainty that I had never signed it. Daniel leaned back, his eyes fixed on me with a mixture of professional focus and personal anger. "Matt, this is not just a family dispute anymore. This is a highly coordinated criminal enterprise. What they have done to you falls squarely under the definition of elder financial abuse, and they have crossed major legal lines under Ohio law." He reached out and tapped the laptop screen, pointing to the transfer date. "First, let's talk about the deed transfer. Under the Ohio Revised Code, specifically ORC Section 2913.31, forging a signature on a deed or any official property record is a third-degree felony. Because they forged your signature to transfer the Upper Arlington home directly to their names, the transfer is legally void ab initio. That is a Latin term, meaning void from the very beginning. In the eyes of the law, the transaction never occurred because a forged deed can never pass legal title. They do not own that house, Matt, even if the county register currently says they do. But proving the forgery requires us to present undeniable evidence in court, and right now they have you legally bound by the conservatorship." "What about the conservatorship itself?" I asked, my voice tight. "They used your forged signature to establish the trust, and then used the trust's existence and their fabricated medical claims to secure the conservatorship," Daniel explained, his voice low and intense. "This is a direct violation of ORC, Section 2913.49, which covers identity fraud. They used your personal identifying information and signature to represent you without your consent. In Ohio, when the victim is an elderly person, meaning over the age of 60, identity fraud is elevated to a third-degree felony. The combination of ORC Section 2913.49 and Section 2913.31 carries mandatory prison time. They are playing a very dangerous game. They think they can keep you quiet and locked away before you can ever bring this to a judge. I took a slow sip of my lukewarm coffee, absorbing the statutory details. And the corporate assets? What about the documents Julianne was signing in the executive office? Daniel's face grew even darker. He scrolled through a separate document on his screen, pulling up financial filings. This is where the corporate betrayal gets even worse. Zachary is engaging in massive corporate asset dissipation. He has not just been spending company profits. He has been actively pledging the physical assets of Crawford Commercial HVAC, the warehouses, the service fleet, and the heavy manufacturing equipment as collateral for high-risk offshore margin trading accounts. He is using the value of the company to secure loans for speculative currency trading. If those trades go bad, the offshore lenders will immediately seize our warehouses and equipment. He is draining the lifeblood of the company to fund a gambling habit. Is that legal? I asked. As CEO, he has a fiduciary duty to the corporation and the shareholders, Daniel said, shaking his head. Pledging corporate assets for personal or high-risk speculative trading that does not benefit the business is a direct breach of that duty. In a standard corporate setting, the board would fire him instantly and sue him for asset dissipation. But under the current conservatorship, Zachary has emergency control over your board votes as well. He has essentially locked the board's hands. He is using your own shares to protect himself from being fired. The legal picture was clear. Zachary and Julianne had constructed a cage. They had forged my signature to steal my home under ORC Section 2913.31, making the transfer void ab initio. They had committed elder financial abuse and identity fraud under ORC Section 2913.49, and they were actively dissipating the corporate assets of Crawford Commercial HVAC to fund their offshore accounts. I looked at Daniel. How do we fight this? If I go to a judge, how long will it take to throw out the conservatorship and prove the forgery? A standard legal challenge could take 6 months, Daniel said honestly. By then, the company will be bankrupt, your properties will be sold, and your savings will be sitting in a bank account in the Cayman Islands. They are moving fast, Matt. We cannot rely on the slow grind of the probate court. We need to find the raw evidence of their theft. We need the physical files, the transfer logs, and the offshore account details. If we can get the actual data, we can go directly to the federal authorities and the bank managers with a package they cannot ignore. I sat back in the vinyl booth. The noise of the diner, the clatter of plates, and the low chatter of the truck drivers faded into the background. I knew what I had to do. I had to get into the company's mainframe. I had to bypass Zachary's digital blocks and download the evidence myself. I can get the data, I told Daniel, my voice cold and calm. Zachary thinks he has locked me out of the company. He thinks because he revoked my badge and remote passwords, I am helpless. But he forgot that I built the physical server room in the basement of the headquarters. I installed a hardwired master override 20 years ago. It is tied to my biometrics, not a password. If I can get into the server room, I can download every financial transaction, every forged document, and every offshore wire transfer log. Daniel stared at me, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. If you can get that data, Matt, I can draft a legal package that will dismantle their trust and throw Zachary in prison. But you have to be careful. If they catch you in that building, they will use the conservatorship to have the police put you in a psychiatric hold. They will say you are having a senile episode. You will be locked away before I can help you. They won't catch me, I said. I know that building better than they ever will. The war has started, Daniel. Let's make sure we have the ammunition. I walked out of the roadside diner with Daniel's warnings ringing in my ears. The freezing night air hit my face, but I felt absolutely nothing. My own son had forged my signature. He had stolen the very house where his mother had tucked him into bed. If I drove back to my estate right now, I would be walking into a trap. Zachary and Julianne could have me removed by the police, and under the conservatorship, they could easily have me committed to a facility. I climbed into the cab of my vintage Ford pickup truck and drove to a modest motel on the edge of the county line. The motel was a rundown place with a flickering neon sign that read vacancy. The parking lot was filled with slush and rusted cars. I walked into the small lobby, paid the clerk with cash, and did not use my real name. The clerk did not care. He was a young man with a tired look, and he barely glanced up from his television as he slid a plastic keycard across the counter. I walked down the exterior corridor to my room, which smelled of stale tobacco and cheap cleaning chemicals. I sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress and stared at the wall. The silence of the room was different from the silence of my home. It was the silence of a man who had been stripped of everything except his mind and his resolve. I had to stay focused. Anger is a useless emotion in business, and it is even more dangerous in a war. I had to dismantle Zachary's illusion of absolute control. To do that, I needed the raw, undeniable proof of his corporate theft. Zachary had always looked at me as an obsolete relic. He believed that because I did not understand modern cloud computing, I was blind to the inner workings of the company. He thought his new firewalls and security tokens had permanently locked me out. But Zachary was arrogant, and arrogance breeds oversight. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I removed the battery and the SIM card, replacing it with a cheap burner phone I had purchased at a gas station. I dialed a number I knew by heart. It belonged to Mike Navarro, a private investigator I had kept on retainer for over 10 years. Mike was a former police detective who knew how to find things that people wanted to keep hidden. He was quiet, efficient, and loyal to the hand that paid him. "Mike," I said when he answered, "I need your help. I need a military-grade encrypted hard drive with the highest possible transfer speed, and I need it tonight." Mike did not ask questions. He knew the tone of my voice. "The grocery store parking lot on Broad Street, midnight. Park in the back near the loading docks." "I will be there," I said, and hung up. I sat in the dark motel room for a few hours, watching the digital clock on the bedside table slow down. The heater in the corner of the room buzzed and rattled, blowing dry, dusty air that made my eyes itch. I thought about the first winter Diane and I had spent in our first apartment. We had no heater, just a small electric radiator that barely kept the frost off the windows. We had survived that, and we had built an empire. I was not going to let a couple of spoiled thieves take it away from me now. At 11:30, I got back into my truck and drove through the quiet streets of Columbus. The snow was falling heavier now, blanketing the roads in white. I pulled into the grocery store parking lot, which was empty except for a few delivery trucks. I parked in the shadow of a large brick wall near the loading docks and turned off the headlights. A few minutes later, a dark SUV pulled into the lot and parked a few spaces away. The headlights flashed once. I opened my door and stepped out into the cold. Mike Navarro got out of his SUV. His collar turned up against the wind. We met between the two vehicles, our breath rising in white clouds. "Here is what you asked for," Mike said, handing me a small, heavy black metal case. "It is a solid-state drive, military-grade encryption, and it has a custom interface that can bypass standard operating system logs during a transfer. Whatever you copy won't leave a digital footprint on the host system." "Thank you, Mike," I said, reaching into my coat and handing him an envelope containing $2,000 in cash. "I need you to do one more thing for me. I need you to set up surveillance on Zachary and Julianne. I want to know who they are meeting, where they are going, and what they are talking about. I want to know if they are planning to move any assets out of the country." Mike took the envelope, sliding it into his pocket. "I will get on it tonight. Zachary has been spending a lot of time with a private wealth manager who specializes in offshore accounts. I will track their movements and let you know what I find." We stood in the freezing lot for another 15 minutes, discussing the details of the surveillance. Mike explained that he had a team of 2 other investigators who could help watch both the Upper Arlington house and the corporate headquarters. He promised to keep a close eye on Julianne's daily visits to the local bank and Zachary's meetings at the country club. I told him to report only through the burner phone, using a coded message if necessary. "Be careful," I warned him. "They have lawyers and they are moving fast." "I am always careful, Matt," Mike said with a quick nod. "Get some rest. You look like you have been through a war." "It is just beginning," I said. I climbed back into my truck, the metal case resting on the passenger seat. I drove back to the motel, my mind plotting the next step. I had the tool I needed to gather the evidence. Now I had to get into the building. I had to wait for the late-night cleaning crews to finish and the building to be completely empty. I would enter through the maintenance tunnel, a path Zachary did not know existed. I would get the data, and I would take back my life. I sat in my truck, watching the digital numbers on the dashboard slowly change. It was 1:45 in the morning. The downtown business district was quiet, the office buildings standing like giant dark towers against the winter sky. I needed the building to be completely empty. I knew the late-night cleaning crews finished their rounds by 1:30, leaving only a single security guard stationed at the front desk. At 2 lean, I put the truck in gear and drove toward the Crawford headquarters. I did not park in the building's lot or anywhere near the front entrance. I drove 2 blocks away and parked in a narrow, dark alley behind an old brick warehouse. I turned off the engine, pulled the collar of my heavy coat up to cover my face, and stepped out into the freezing night. The snow had stopped falling, but the air was bitterly cold, and the wind made my eyes water. The streets were deserted, the streetlights reflecting off the black ice on the asphalt. I walked briskly toward the rear loading docks of the Crawford building. Zachary had recently spent a fortune upgrading the security system, installing high-definition cameras and motion sensors at every entrance. He believed he had made the building a fortress, but he did not know about the maintenance tunnel. Back when we broke ground on the headquarters 20 years ago, I had insisted on a subterranean service corridor that connected the building's primary electrical vault to the municipal storm system. It was designed as an emergency exit and a way for utility workers to access the main lines without disrupting the offices. The entrance was a heavy iron grate located behind a large industrial trash dumpster, completely out of the line of sight of Zachary's cameras. I slipped behind the steel dumpster, the smell of rotten food and wet cardboard thick in the air. I found the old iron grate, which was covered in ice. I reached into my coat and pulled out a heavy steel crowbar. I jammed the edge of the tool under the frozen frame and pulled with all the strength in my arms. The metal groaned, the ice cracking with a sharp sound, and the grate lifted. I slid the crowbar into my pocket, grabbed the edge of the opening, and lowered myself into the dark, damp tunnel. I dropped onto the concrete floor of the passage, the splash of shallow water echoing in the narrow space. I pulled a small tactical flashlight from my pocket and turned it on, keeping the beam pointed at the floor. The tunnel was cold and smelled of damp earth and rust. I navigated the passage, keeping my head low to avoid the metal pipes running along the ceiling. I had to squeeze through several narrow sections where the utility pipes had been updated, the rough concrete walls scraping against my heavy wool coat. I reached the heavy reinforced steel door at the end of the tunnel. This was the back entrance to the sub-basement of the building. It did not use an electronic keypad or a digital card scanner. I reached into my pocket, pulled out a heavy brass skeleton key I had kept on my keyring for 20 years, and slid it into the mechanical lock. The tumblers clicked, and the heavy door opened smoothly. I stepped into the dry, warm air of the sub-basement. The ambient hum of the building's massive heating and ventilation systems was a low, comforting vibration. I moved silently through the concrete corridors, passing the rows of electrical panels and water pumps. I did not turn on my flashlight here. The emergency lights cast a dim yellow glow on the floor. I knew the schedule of the guard. He would be in the lobby, likely watching a portable television or sleeping. I headed straight for the central server room. It was a concrete bunker located in the center of the basement, secured behind a thick security door. This room housed the physical mainframe of the company's network. I approached the access panel. It was an older biometric terminal, untouched by Zachary's modern renovations. I placed my right hand onto the glass scanner. A thin line of red light swept across my palm, mapping the lines of my skin. The terminal hummed, processing the physical data. Next, a small digital lens extended from the wall. I leaned forward, aligning my right eye with the green targeting reticle. The scanner pulsed, casting a beam of light into my eye to analyze the vascular structure of my retina, comparing the data against the master override protocol. For 3 agonizing seconds, the terminal remained silent. My heart beat heavily against my ribs. If the system engineers had deleted my biometric profiles without my knowledge, the silent alarms would trigger, and the police would be here in minutes. I would be trapped in the basement, arrested for corporate espionage in my own building. I held my breath, listening for any sign of movement from the corridor behind me. Then the door let out a loud electronic click. The light on the panel turned green and the heavy deadbolts retracted. I grabbed the handle and pulled the door open. I stepped into the freezing server room. The air was cold, kept at 62 degrees to protect the electronics. Rows of black server racks stood like silent soldiers, their faces blinking with thousands of tiny blue and green lights. The noise of the cooling fans was deafening, but it sounded like victory to me. I walked to the master console in the center of the room. I flipped the cover off the physical override port, exposing the direct connection to the mainframe. I unzipped my coat, pulled out the military-grade hard drive Navarro had given me, and plugged the cable into the port. The monitor screen on the console immediately booted up, recognizing my biometric authority. I typed in a sequence of legacy command codes, bypassing the modern firewalls, and opened the root directories. I targeted the financial folders and hit execute. The progress bar appeared on the screen and the drive began downloading the secret accounting files of Crawford Commercial HVAC. I stood alone in the cold, watching the blue light of the progress bar slowly climb as the files copied to my drive. The blue light of the progress bar crept across the monitor screen like a slow-moving glacier. I stood in the freezing server room, my breath forming faint white clouds in the cold air. The military-grade hard drive Navarro had given me hummed quietly as it digested blocks of encrypted corporate data. I knew the complete transfer would take at least 20 minutes. 20 minutes is a very long time when you are standing in a secure basement room where you are legally considered an intruder. The hum of the servers was a constant, mind-numbing roar, but I could not let myself drift. To pass the time and satisfy the burning anxiety in my chest, I opened a secondary terminal window on the console. I bypassed the main directory and accessed the raw network traffic data. I wanted to see what my son had been hiding behind his new corporate firewalls. I had to type carefully, using my old command structures that were programmed into the system back when we first installed the server bank. I opened the master ledger for the third quarter. The spreadsheet populated the screen, showing thousands of individual transaction line items. At a casual glance, everything looked perfectly normal. The payroll distributions were accurate, the supplier invoices matched the projections, and the overhead costs for our distribution centers aligned with historical averages. Zachary had hired someone very skilled to paint this picture of corporate health. They had even falsified the standard invoices from our parts vendors to make it look like our cash flow was healthy. But I did not build a $40 million company by looking only at the surface. I knew the rhythm of this business better than I knew my own heartbeat. I knew when we typically paid our suppliers and what the average cost of materials should be for a commercial HVAC installation. I isolated the outgoing vendor payments and filtered them by date, specifically targeting the exact month Zachary took over as Chief Executive Officer. The true story emerged almost immediately. Hidden beneath the massive, legitimate purchases of industrial copper piping and commercial-grade air conditioning units, there was a steady, quiet leak of cash. I found a recurring weekly outgoing wire transfer of $45, to an entity listed as Apex Logistics Solutions. The invoices were vaguely coded as expedited supply chain management fees. They had been paid every single week, without fail since last November. I cross-referenced our approved vendor database. Apex Logistics Solutions did not exist in our system before Zachary became CEO. I ran a search through the state corporate registry database using the raw command terminal. Apex Logistics Solutions was a limited liability company registered to a generic post office box in Delaware. The listed managing director was a corporate proxy firm. It was a classic shell company, designed to hide the identity of the true owner. My son was bleeding the company dry. He was taking $45,000 every single week and writing it off as shipping costs. I kept digging, my fingers moving across the keyboard with a cold fury. Apex Logistics Solutions was just the beginning. I uncovered 5 more ghost entities: Horizon Strategic Ventures, Summit Global Purchasing, Pinnacle Consulting Partners. Every single one of them was a fabricated shell company, siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars out of our operating capital under the guise of consulting fees, marketing advice, and administrative services. Over the last 12 months, Zachary had embezzled nearly $4 million directly from the primary operational accounts of Crawford Commercial HVAC. The scale of the theft was staggering. I stood in the cold room looking at the screen, my mind racing. $4 million was a massive loss, but Crawford Commercial HVAC generated $40 million in annual revenue. A $4 million deficit would hurt our profit margins, but it would not bankrupt the company. Yet, the internal cash flow indicators on the screen were flashing severe warnings. The company was drowning in a liquidity crisis, struggling to pay its actual suppliers. The main account balances were dangerously low, and we were falling behind on payments to our steel and copper vendors. This meant there was a much larger problem. $4 million was just the cash he had taken for himself. He had to be doing something else with the company's value. I opened the central collateral registries, holding my breath as the files decrypted. What I found next made the physical embezzlement look like a minor administrative error. Zachary was not merely stealing cash to fund his and Julianne's luxurious lifestyle. He was using the entire company as a gambling chip. I opened a directory labeled Offshore Liabilities. My son had taken the physical assets of Crawford Commercial HVAC, the heavy machinery, the warehouses, the service trucks, and he had pledged them as collateral for high-risk offshore margin accounts. He was borrowing tens of millions of dollars from unregulated international financial institutions, using the lifeblood of my company to guarantee the loans. He was funneling the borrowed capital into highly volatile foreign exchange markets and risky short-term investment schemes. He was playing financial roulette with the empire Diane and I had built. If those offshore margin accounts failed, the international lenders would legally seize every asset tied to the Crawford name. They would take the warehouses, the trucks, the tools, and the offices. Zachary had strapped a massive bomb to the core of the company, and the timer was ticking down. My chest tightened with a blinding rage. He had looked me in the eye at that restaurant, slammed his glass, and claimed my savings as his money. All the while, he was actively destroying the company that supported hundreds of families in Columbus. The progress bar on the console flashed, indicating the download was complete. I pulled the hard drive from the port, my hands shaking slightly, and stored it back in its metal case. I had the evidence. I had the proof of his embezzlement and his asset dissipation. I closed the server door, locking it behind me, and retreated back into the dark maintenance tunnel, leaving the building as quietly as I had entered. I crawled back through the damp maintenance tunnel, the cold metal case of the hard drive pressed against my chest. I pushed open the iron grate behind the dumpster, climbed out into the freezing Columbus night, and pulled the grate closed. The wind was still sharp, but my mind was focused on the data I had just downloaded. I walked back to my truck, climbed into the cab, and drove back to my rundown motel room. I set the hard drive on the small table next to the lumpy bed. I opened my personal laptop and connected the drive. Using the decryption keys Daniel had provided, I began analyzing the offshore liabilities files in detail. What I saw on the screen was a detailed map of financial self-destruction. Zachary had opened 3 separate trading accounts with unregulated financial institutions based in the Bahamas and the Seychelles. To secure these accounts, he had signed corporate agreements, pledging the physical assets of Crawford Commercial HVAC as collateral. He had pledged the title to our corporate headquarters, our 3 regional distribution warehouses in Cleveland, Cincinnati, and Toledo, and the entire fleet of 300 service trucks. He had then borrowed $15 million against this collateral to engage in highly leveraged foreign exchange margin trading. Leverage is a double-edged sword. In the hands of an experienced trader, it can amplify gains. In the hands of an arrogant amateur like Zachary, it is a direct path to ruin. Zachary had been betting on the fluctuation of the Japanese yen and the British pound, using leverage factors of up to 100 to 1. The spreadsheets showed that his trading position had been losing money since July. Instead of cutting his losses and closing the accounts, Zachary had done what every desperate gambler does. He doubled down. He borrowed more money against the company's assets to cover the margin calls, believing that the market would turn in his favor. It never did. By early November, the trading accounts had lost a total of $12 million. The international lenders had issued a final margin call, demanding that Zachary deposit $12 million in cash to cover the deficit by Friday morning. If he failed to deposit the cash, the lenders would execute their collateral claims. They would take legal possession of our buildings, our warehouses, and our trucks. This was the reason behind the corporate liquidity crisis. Zachary had been siphoning every dollar of cash flow to feed the margin calls. And now, he was out of time. I looked at the transaction schedule on the screen. I found a pending wire transfer of $12 million, scheduled for Thursday night at 11 p.m. The destination was an account at a private bank in the Cayman Islands. The sending account was the primary operational reserves of Crawford Commercial HVAC. I felt the blood drain from my face. This transfer was not designed to save the company. It was Zachary's escape plan. The $12 million transfer represented the absolute last scrap of liquid cash the company possessed. It was our emergency reserve, the money we used to pay payroll, taxes, and our primary equipment suppliers. If Zachary wired that money to the Cayman Islands, the company would be left with a balance of zero on Friday morning. The margin accounts would fail, the offshore lenders would seize our physical assets, and the company would collapse into bankruptcy. Zachary and Julianne did not care about saving Crawford Commercial HVAC. They knew the house of cards was falling. Their plan was to empty the corporate reserves, wire the $12 million to their private Cayman account, and flee the country before the lenders and the regulators realized what had happened. They were going to leave the company ruined, leaving hundreds of my employees without jobs, and leaving me to face the wreckage. My anger turned into a cold, hard determination. I looked at the date. Today was Wednesday. The transfer was scheduled for Thursday night. I had exactly 24 hours to stop them. I called Daniel Miller on my burner phone. I did not care that it was 3:30 in the morning. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert. "Daniel," I said, "I have the files. It is worse than we thought. Zachary has pledged the warehouses and trucks as collateral for offshore margin trading. He has lost $12 million, and the lenders are calling in the debt. He has scheduled a wire transfer of $12 million, our entire corporate reserve, to the Cayman Islands for Thursday night at 11 p.m. He is going to drain the company and run." The silence from Daniel was heavy. I could hear him shifting in his chair. "If that wire goes through, Matt, the company is dead. The lenders will seize the assets on Friday, and the corporation will be forced into receivership. We have to block that transfer." "How?" I asked. "Zachary has the corporate key codes, and I am legally frozen out." "You still have the master override biometric access," Daniel said. "If you can get to the server console during the transfer, you can execute the poison pill protocol. It is a clause in the company's founding bylaws that allows the chairman to suspend the CEO's authority in the event of documented financial malfeasance. If you execute that protocol, the system will lock all outgoing wire transfers and revoke Zachary's authority instantly." "But I need the legal documents to back it up," I said. "Otherwise, the banks won't recognize the suspension." "I will draft the emergency declaration tonight," Daniel promised. "I will cite the forged deed under ORC Section 2913.31 and the identity fraud under ORC Section 2913.49. I will present the evidence of the shell companies and the offshore margin accounts. We will have a complete package ready for the federal regulators and the bank managers on Friday morning, but you have to block that wire on Thursday night." "I will block it," I said. "Let's make sure the trap is set." I stood by the window, watching the cold snow drift down over the frozen asphalt, remembering how Diane and I used to dream of a quiet life. Every single dollar in our corporate reserve was a testament to the sweat, blood, and tears we had poured into the company for over 4 decades. I spent the rest of Thursday morning in the motel room with Daniel Miller. He had arrived at 7, bringing a box of documents and a fresh pot of coffee. We spread the papers across the table, comparing the downloaded files from the server with the public property records and bank statements. Daniel's eyes were sharp as he highlighted the connections between Zachary's shell companies and the offshore margin accounts. The evidence is absolute, Daniel said, setting down his pen. We have the wire transfer logs from Crawford Commercial HVAC directly to Apex Logistics Solutions. We have the Delaware filings showing that Apex is controlled by a proxy firm that shares an address with Julianne's personal LLC. We have the signature cards for the Bahamas accounts, signed by Zachary as CEO, and the collateral agreements pledging the warehouses. This is a clear pattern of embezzlement and asset dissipation. And the house? I asked. I have compared the signature on the deed transfer with your actual signature from the company's founding documents, Daniel said, pulling out 2 enlarged sheets of paper. The forgery is very good, but under magnification, you can see the hesitation in the strokes. It was done using a tracing light or a digital signature pad. I have drafted an affidavit from a forensic document examiner confirming the forgery. This, combined with ORC Section 2913-31, is enough to get the deed declared void ab initio. The property will return to your name the moment a judge reviews this. We just need to get it in front of the county court. But the conservatorship is still the main obstacle, I noted. Yes, Daniel agreed. We need to prove that the medical diagnosis used to secure the conservatorship was fraudulent. I am working on that, but in the meantime, the poison pill protocol is our best weapon. I have finalized the Declaration of Executive Revocation. This document, signed by you as chairman and backed by this evidence, legally suspends Zachary's authority as CEO. The moment you execute it in the system, he is no longer legally authorized to sign contracts, wire money, or represent the company. It will block him completely. Before we could discuss the plan further, my burner phone rang. It was Mike Navarro. Matt, Mike said, I have the surveillance reports. Zachary and Julianne are at the country club right now, meeting with a wealth manager. But more importantly, I managed to get inside the executive suite last night while the cleaning crew was there. I planted 2 audio transmitters, one under Zachary's desk and one in the private office kitchen. I have the receiver here. You need to listen to this. Where are you? I asked. I am parked in the coffee shop parking lot across the street from the Crawford building, Mike said. Meet me there. I told Daniel to stay in the motel and finish the legal packages. I got into my truck and drove to the downtown coffee shop. The drive was slow as I navigated the traffic, my mind replaying the legal statutes Daniel had explained. The snow was beginning to melt, leaving a dirty gray slush on the roads. I parked next to Mike's SUV and climbed into the passenger seat. Mike handed me a pair of headphones and a small black receiver unit. I have the recording from this morning, Mike said, pressing play on a digital player. They were in Zachary's office before they left for the country club. Listen to what they are planning. It is chilling. I put on the headphones and closed my eyes. The audio was clear, the background hum of the office ventilation system familiar. We have to make sure the wire goes through tonight, Zachary, Julianne's voice said, sounding sharp and demanding. The Bahamian bank needs the cash by Friday morning, or they will start the foreclosure on the Toledo warehouse. If that happens, the board will find out everything. We will lose everything. I know, Zachary's voice replied, sounding tense and exhausted. The Cayman transfer is set for 11 p.m. The bank manager in Georgetown has already confirmed the receipt coordinates. Once the money is in the trust, we can transfer it to the Swiss account. But what about my dad? He is still asking questions. Lawrence Fletcher called me and said he tried to call the bank yesterday. Do not worry about your father, Julianne hissed. The private ambulance crew is scheduled for 8 a.m. on Friday morning. The medical transport team will show up at the Upper Arlington house with the order. They will take him directly to Pinehurst Retreat. The doctor signed the dementia affidavit yesterday. He is legally declared incompetent, Zachary. Even if he tries to tell the police about the house or the money, they will just see him as a senile old man who is hallucinating. By the time anyone looks at the files, we will be in Switzerland. Are you sure the doctor won't talk? Zachary asked. We paid him $50,000, Julianne said coldly. He knows what to say. Once Matt is in the dementia ward at Pinehurst, they will put him on a heavy regimen of sedatives. He won't be writing any checks or calling any lawyers. We will have complete control over the estate and we can liquidate the rest of the properties from Europe. I took off the headphones, my hands cold. The sheer malice of their plan was breathtaking. They were not just stealing my money and my company. They were planning to kidnap me, lock me in an asylum, and drug me into silence so they could spend my wealth in Switzerland. They had planned to do it in the house I built. I looked at Mike. "You captured the whole conversation?" "Every word," Mike said, nodding. "The audio file is backed up on 3 different, secure servers. It is clear, Matt. They are planning a kidnapping and medical fraud. This is a federal conspiracy. I also have photographs of them meeting the doctor at a restaurant last night, handing over the check." "Keep the bugs active," I said, my voice sounding like ice. "I want to hear Zachary's reaction when the wire transfer fails tonight." "The trap is set, Mike. Let's make sure they walk right into it. I will head back to the server room tonight." I returned to my rundown motel room on the edge of the county line, my chest tight with a mixture of fury and anticipation. The snow was falling again outside, coating the highway in a thick, silent layer of white. The neon sign outside my window flickered, casting a dim red glow across the faded wallpaper. Inside, the room was warm, the small electric heater in the corner humming and vibrating as it fought against the winter chill. I sat at the small wooden table and set up the receiver Mike Navarro had given me. I plugged in the headphones, adjusted the frequency dial, and began listening to the live transmission from the executive suite at Crawford Commercial HVAC. It was 4:30 in the afternoon, and the corporate offices were beginning to wind down for the day. Employees were packing up their belongings, talking about their weekend plans, and leaving the building to head home to their families. But inside Zachary's corner office, the tension was high. The audio quality was surprisingly clear, capturing the ambient noise of the building's ventilation system and the clatter of traffic from the street below. I could hear the sharp heels of Julianne's designer boots clicking restlessly against the hardwood floor. "We need to go over the schedule one more time, Zachary." Julianne's voice came through the headphones, sounding sharp, demanding, and impatient. "I have already confirmed our flight tickets to Zurich. We leave tomorrow on Friday afternoon at exactly 2. The wire transfer to the Cayman Islands goes out tonight at 11. Once that money hits the Cayman account, the Bahamian bank will clear the margin debt on the trading accounts, and the remaining $8 million will be shifted to our Swiss account by Friday morning. We cannot afford any mistakes or delays. What about the Toledo and Cincinnati warehouses?" Zachary asked, his voice shaking slightly and sounding thin. "The buyers are expecting the deeds signed by Friday morning. If we are already gone, the transfers might get flagged by the escrow agents. I don't want the title companies calling the office when we are in the air." "The deeds are already signed," Julianne replied, her voice cold, confident, and completely devoid of hesitation. "I signed them myself using your father's signature stamp and the power of attorney documents. The escrow accounts will release the funds directly to our offshore account by noon on Friday. That is another $4 million in cash. We don't need to be here for the physical closing. Once we land in Zurich, we are completely untouchable by the Ohio courts." "It feels like everything is moving too fast," Zachary muttered, and I heard the sound of liquid pouring into a glass. He was likely drinking scotch again. "My father is still out there. What if he goes to the board before the wire goes through tonight? What if he calls Daniel Miller? You know Daniel has contacts in the county court and knows every corporate lawyer in Columbus." "Your father has no access to money, Zachary," Julianne said, laughing with a sound that made my skin crawl. "He cannot even pay for his truck's gasoline. His cards are declined, his bank accounts are frozen under the emergency conservatorship order, and his phone is disconnected. He is an old man sitting in an empty house, wondering why the world has forgotten him. Even if he calls Daniel, what can Daniel do? The court order is signed by a judge. The legal process to challenge a conservatorship takes months of hearings and evaluations. By the time they even get a court date, Crawford Commercial HVAC will be an empty shell, and we will be living in a villa in Switzerland." I listened to them plan the destruction of my life's work. They were selling off the Toledo and Cincinnati distribution warehouses, the very properties that served our largest regional contracts. They were siphoning the last remaining cash from our operational reserves. They were leaving the company bankrupt, leaving 300 employees without jobs, and leaving the name Crawford ruined. I took a slow, deep breath, my heart beating in a steady, cold rhythm. Zachary was my son, the boy Diane and I had raised, the boy we had hoped would carry our legacy into the future. Now, he was sitting in my old office, discussing how to strip the company to the bone and leave me to face the wreckage. He was not just stealing my money, he was stealing my honor, my name, and the security of the people who had worked for me for decades. I thought about the first warehouse we built in Cincinnati. Diane and I had spent 3 weeks painting the exterior walls ourselves, saving money on labor. Now, Julianne was signing it away like it was a piece of junk. I remembered the long nights we spent cataloging parts, the freezing mornings we spent loading trucks, and the pride we felt when the company finally hit $1 million in revenue. All of that was being erased by two thieves who had never worked a day in the mud. I just hope the Cayman transfer doesn't get delayed, Zachary said, his voice sounding smaller. If the bank's security team flags the transaction, it could take 24 hours to clear. The compliance officers are always looking for large outgoing wires. It won't be delayed, Julianne assured him. I spoke with the manager in Georgetown. He knows the funds are coming from a corporate operational account. He has the compliance documents ready. We have categorized the transfer as an emergency purchase of industrial refrigeration units from a foreign supplier. The paperwork is perfect. Nobody will suspect a thing until Friday morning, and by then, the money will be gone. We have set up the accounts to receive the transfer immediately. I took off the headphones. The details were clear. The wire transfer was scheduled for 11 p.m. tonight. They were siphoning $12 million under the guise of an emergency equipment purchase. They had already forged my signature to sell the Toledo and Cincinnati warehouses, and they were planning to flee to Zurich on Friday afternoon. I looked at the digital clock on the motel desk. It was 5:15 p.m. I had exactly 5 hours and 45 minutes to prepare. I stood up, walked to the window, and watched the snow fall onto the highway. The trap was set. Zachary and Julianne believed they were playing a game of chess against a senile old man who had already lost his pieces. They had no idea that the king was still on the board and that the final move belonged to me. I would make sure they paid for every single thing they had stolen. I would take back my company and my life. I sat back down at the motel desk, the headphones pressed against my ears. I needed to know the details of their plan for my medical extraction. If they were planning to have me committed on Friday morning, I had to know exactly how they were going to do it. The bugs in the executive suite were still transmitting, the audio clear. What about the private ambulance? Zachary's voice came through, sounding nervous and hesitant. Are you sure they won't ask questions? If my father fights back, it could cause a scene in the neighborhood. Upper Arlington is a quiet area, and the neighbors know him. He has lived there for 20 years. If they see him being dragged out of his house, someone is going to call the local police. They won't ask questions, Zachary, Julianne said, her voice sounding sharp, cold, and dismissive of his fears. We hired a private medical transport company called Vanguard Health. They specialize in transport for elderly patients with cognitive issues. They are paid to execute court-ordered placements, not to investigate them. They will show up at the house at exactly 8:00 a.m. on Friday morning. They have a copy of the co-conservatorship order and the dementia affidavit signed by Dr. Edward Crane. If Matt tries to fight or yell, they will simply medicate him for his own safety. It is all legal, Zachary. They have the authority to use physical restraints if he is deemed a danger to himself or others. The transport team is professional and handles this every day. Dr. Edward Crane, Zachary murmured. I still can't believe he signed that paper. He has been our family doctor for 10 years. He knows my father is sharp. He treated him for his knee surgery last year and commented on how active his mind was. He knows your father is old, Julianne corrected him. And more importantly, he knows that $50,000 in cash can pay off his daughter's college tuition. He signed the affidavit confirming that Matt is suffering from advanced, rapidly progressing senile dementia with severe cognitive decline. He stated that Matt is no longer capable of recognizing his family, managing his daily hygiene, or making logical decisions. In the eyes of the court, that affidavit is the final word. That is why the judge signed the conservatorship order without requiring a personal interview with Matt. They believed it was an emergency. The law allows the court to waive the interview if a doctor certifies the patient is too unstable to travel or communicate, and once he is at Pinehurst Retreat, Zachary asked. Pinehurst is a private facility, Julianne said, her voice dripping with cold satisfaction. We have already paid the first 3 months of his stay from his personal savings account. The director there knows us and knows our financial position. Matt will be placed in the high-security dementia ward. He won't have access to phones, visitors, or mail without our approval as his conservators. The staff will keep him on a steady regimen of sedatives to keep him calm. Even if Daniel Miller tries to visit him, he won't be allowed in without our written consent. Matt will spend the rest of his days sitting in a wheelchair, looking at the gardens, completely harmless. He won't be able to interfere with our lives or our money ever again. My blood ran absolutely cold. Dr. Edward Crane, a man I had trusted with my health, a man I had invited to my home for dinners, had sold my sanity for $50,000. He had written a sworn statement declaring my mind broken, knowing it would be used to imprison me. They were planning to lock me in Pinehurst Retreat, a facility known for housing wealthy patients whose families wanted them out of the way. They were going to drug me, strip me of my voice, and let my mind rot in a locked ward while they lived off my sweat in Switzerland. The horror of the plan was matched only by the precision of their cruelty. They had thought of everything. They had used the legal system as a weapon, turning the laws designed to protect the elderly into a cage to trap me. They had bought a doctor, deceived a judge, and hired an ambulance team to kidnap me from my own home. They had turned my own house, the sanctuary I had built for Diane, into the place of my arrest. "It is a perfect plan, Zachary," Julianne said, her voice sounding closer to the desk. "We just need to get through tonight. Once the wire is executed, the company is finished, and we can leave the rest to the lawyers. Let's go to the country club and meet with the wealth manager. I want to make sure the Swiss coordinates are finalized. The flight leaves at 2:00 p.m. tomorrow, so we have to pack our bags tonight. I have already sorted through my jewelry and the important papers." "Okay," Zachary said. "Let's go. I need a drink. This whole thing has my nerves on edge. I feel like my dad is watching me." I heard the office door close, and then the audio feed went quiet. I took off the headphones, my hands shaking with a cold rage. I sat in the silent motel room, the dim yellow light of the bedside lamp casting long shadows on the wall. They had bought a doctor. They had forged my signature under ORC Section 291331. They had committed identity fraud under ORC Section 291349. They had planned to lock me in Pinehurst Retreat. The evidence was no longer just about financial theft. It was about my survival, my freedom, and my sanity. I looked at the solid-state drive sitting on the table. It contained the financial proof of their embezzlement, the shell companies, and the offshore margin accounts. Now I had the audio recording of their kidnapping conspiracy. I had the name of the corrupt doctor and the private transport company. I had everything I needed to destroy them. I just had to survive the next 24 hours. I would make sure they never saw Switzerland. At 6:30 p.m., Daniel Miller returned to the motel room, carrying a fresh stack of legal documents and a serious look on his face. I played the audio recording for him, watching his expression shift from professional interest to deep, personal shock. He sat in the vinyl chair, his jaw tightened, his fingers gripping the edge of the table as Julianne's voice detailed the plan to commit me to Pinehurst Retreat. The rattle of the motel heater seemed to fade into the background as the reality of their betrayal filled the small, dimly lit room. "This is monstrous, Matt," Daniel said when the audio finished. "They are not just siphoning money. They are committing a federal conspiracy to kidnap you and execute medical fraud. Dr. Edward Crane has committed a severe felony by signing a fraudulent affidavit. This recording, combined with the financial files, changes everything. We don't just have a civil case for corporate asset dissipation. We have a massive criminal case. They have crossed the line from corporate theft to physical endangerment. They are planning to take away your very identity and lock you in a dark room forever. What is the plan, Daniel? I asked, my voice steady, though my heart burned with a quiet, dangerous fire. The wire transfer is scheduled for 11:00 p.m. tonight. How do we block it, and how do we protect me from the ambulance on Friday morning? We have to move fast. We only have a few hours. Daniel opened his leather folder and pulled out a document printed on heavy official paper. First, we execute the poison pill protocol. I have finalized the declaration of executive revocation. Under Article 9 of the Crawford Commercial HVAC bylaws, the chairman of the board has the unilateral authority to suspend the CEO's executive powers if there is clear, documented evidence of financial malfeasance that threatens the solvency of the corporation. I drafted this clause myself when we incorporated the company 20 years ago. It was designed to protect the business from a hostile takeover or a rogue partner who lost his mind. We never thought we would use it against Zachary, but the clause is ironclad. He tapped the document, pointing to the bullet points. I have attached the spreadsheets showing the $4 million embezzlement through Horizon Strategic Ventures and Apex Logistics Solutions. I have attached the documents showing the Toledo and Cincinnati warehouse deeds, which were forged under ORC Section 2913-31, making them void ab initio. I have also attached the collateral agreements for the offshore margin accounts, proving corporate asset dissipation. This is more than enough to satisfy the bylaws. It provides a complete, undeniable record of malfeasance. The system will recognize the authority instantly. How do we execute it? I asked. You must log into the company's central server console, Daniel explained. Using your biometric credentials, you will upload this signed declaration to the corporate registry. Once uploaded, the system will automatically trigger a master lockout. It will revoke Zachary's administrative access keys, freeze all pending outgoing wire transfers, and notify the company's treasury bank to hold all transactions. It will happen instantly, and he won't be able to bypass it. The system will log him out of his own terminal and lock his digital identity. He will be powerless in the system. And what about the legal side? The moment you execute the lockout, I will send this complete legal package to the Ohio Attorney General, the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, Daniel said. I have already contacted a colleague at the Attorney General's office. He is standing by tonight. Once he receives the audio recording of the kidnapping conspiracy and the proof of the forged deeds, he will initiate an emergency federal investigation. They will issue warrants for Zachary, Julianne, and Dr. Edward Crane by Friday morning. The police will be ready. They will arrest them before they can reach the airport. Their plans to flee will be cut short. I looked at the document. It was the formal declaration of my return. It was the instrument that would strip Zachary of his power and expose his crimes to the world. I took the pen from Daniel's hand and signed my name on the bottom line. Matthew Vance, chairman of the board. The stroke of my pen felt firm, a declaration that I was still the master of my own life, that my mind was sharp and my will unbroken. I thought of Diane as I wrote my name. I was doing this for her memory and for the family name they had dragged through the dirt. This will stop the wire, I said. But what about the ambulance? If the court order is still active on Friday morning, the transport team will still show up at my house. They will. Daniel nodded. But you won't be there, and more importantly, I am filing an emergency motion to vacate the conservatorship with the county probate judge tonight at 10 p.m. I have a personal relationship with Judge Vance, no relation to you, who handles probate emergencies. Once she reads Dr. Edward Crane's name and listens to the recording of Julianne admitting they paid him $50,000, she will suspend the conservatorship order immediately. She will issue a stay, blocking any medical transport or commitment. The order will be delivered to the local police by midnight, and they will have the authority to intercept Vanguard Health. So, the ambulance team will be walking into a trap, I said. Exactly, Daniel said, a grim smile appearing on his face. When they show up at 8 a.m. on Friday, they won't find a helpless, senile old man. They will find the local police and the FBI waiting for them. The police will seize the transport team's records, and the FBI will proceed to arrest Zachary and Julianne for conspiracy and fraud. The doctor will be arrested at his office. We have them completely cornered. They have no exit, Matt. They built a trap for you, but they are the ones who will be locked inside. I sat back, looking at the signed revocation. The pieces were in place. We had the financial files, the forged deeds, the audio recording, and the legal declarations. We had the support of the Attorney General's office and a probate court. I would head back to the server room tonight. I would look Zachary in the eye through the screen and take back what is mine. The cold Columbus night was waiting, but I was ready. At 8:30 p.m., I left the motel room and drove toward the downtown area. The snow had stopped, and the streets were quiet, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement. The slush on the roads was starting to freeze, creating a dangerous sheen of black ice. I did not drive to the Crawford headquarters yet. I had one more stop to make. I needed to ensure that our Treasury Bank was prepared for the executive revocation. I had to make sure the door was shut tight before the storm hit. I parked my truck outside a small private office building in the financial district. This was the personal residence of Lawrence Fletcher, my private banker. Lawrence had been managing my personal accounts and the corporate treasury of Crawford Commercial HVAC for over 15 years. He was a conservative, quiet man who valued order and security above all else. He was a man who knew the rules and respected them. He had watched our company grow from a small local service provider into a multi-state enterprise, and he had always been a reliable partner. I walked up the steps and rang the bell. Lawrence opened the door, wearing a heavy wool sweater. When he saw me standing on his porch, his eyes went wide with shock and fear, his jaw dropping slightly. "Matt," he whispered, looking around the quiet, snow-covered street as if he expected someone to be watching. "What are you doing here?" Zachary and his lawyers were in my office this morning. They presented a court order. "I was told that you were incapacitated. They said you were suffering from severe cognitive decline and could not make decisions." "Do I look incapacitated to you, Lawrence?" I asked, my voice calm, firm, and carrying the weight of absolute clarity. Lawrence stared at me, studying my face, my posture, and the clear focus in my eyes. He took a long moment to process the contradiction before him. "No, you don't. You look like the man you have always been. Come in, please." I walked into his warm study, which was lined with books and smelled of leather and tea. I did not waste time with small talk. We sat at his desk, and I pulled the hard drive case from my coat and opened my laptop. I showed him the financial logs, the shell company siphoning $4 million, and the collateral agreements pledging the company's warehouses for offshore margin trading. Lawrence sat in his leather chair, his face turning pale as he read the spreadsheets. This is corporate asset dissipation on a massive scale. Zachary has pledged the Toledo and Cincinnati warehouses. Those are the primary collateral for our operational lines of credit. If the lenders seize those, the bank will have to call in our loans immediately. The company will go under. We would have to liquidate everything to cover the debt. The suppliers would go unpaid, and the business would be ruined in days. "It gets worse, Lawrence," I said. I pulled out my phone and played the audio recording of Julianne and Zachary discussing the Cayman wire transfer and their plan to commit me to Pinehurst Retreat. Lawrence listened, his hand shaking as he took a sip of his tea. His expression shifted from disbelief to deep anger. When the audio finished, he looked up at me, his eyes filled with genuine horror. "They paid Dr. Edward Crane $50,000 to sign a fake dementia affidavit, and they are wiring $12 million of the company's cash reserves tonight at 11 p.m.? Matt, that is the entire operational reserve. If that money leaves the Treasury, we won't be able to cover payroll tomorrow morning. The company will be insolvent by 9 a.m. This is theft. It is the absolute destruction of the business." "I know," I said. "That is why I am here. I have signed the formal declaration of executive revocation. Under the company bylaws, I am suspending Zachary's authority as CEO immediately. I will upload the declaration to the server console tonight at 10:45 p.m. I need you to ensure that the bank honors the revocation the moment it is executed." Lawrence did not hesitate. "If you upload that signed revocation using your biometric override, it will automatically update the corporate registry. I will log into the bank's secure portal from here and verify the update. The moment I see the revocation in the system, I will freeze the corporate accounts against Zachary's access keys. The $12 million transfer will be blocked before it can clear the Federal Reserve network. We will hold the wire. Zachary won't be able to move a single dollar out of the accounts. And Zachary's personal accounts, the trust accounts they set up using your forged signature, will be frozen as well, Lawrence said, his voice firm and decisive. We will hold all assets pending a formal investigation by the Ohio Attorney General. I will cooperate fully with the authorities, Matt. I cannot believe Zachary would do this to you. He was always a difficult kid, but this is criminal. He has betrayed everything you built. He has betrayed his mother's memory. He let Julianne convince him that he was the owner of the empire, I said. He forgot that respect is earned, not stolen. He thought he could buy his way out of responsibility. I will be at my computer, waiting for the system update, Lawrence promised, shaking my hand. Good luck, Matt. Take back your company. I will block the wire on my end the moment you hit the key. We will protect the assets. I walked out of Lawrence's house, the cold air clearing my head. The support of the Treasury Bank was the final piece of the financial trap. Once I uploaded the revocation, Zachary would have no access to the corporate cash, no access to his personal trust accounts, and no way to execute the Cayman wire. He would be completely frozen out of the financial system, just as he had frozen me out yesterday morning. The tables were turning, and the final hour was approaching. I got into my truck and drove toward the headquarters. The final battle was about to begin in the dark. It was 10:30 p.m. when I parked my vintage Ford pickup truck in the dark alley 2 blocks away from the Crawford headquarters. The night was quiet, the freezing wind blowing loose snow across the cold asphalt. I pulled my coat collar up, grabbed the heavy metal case containing my encrypted solid-state drive, and walked toward the rear loading docks. I did not use the front glass doors of the lobby, where a single security guard was stationed, likely reading a book or watching the monitors. I slipped behind the steel dumpster, lifted the ice-covered iron grate, and slid down into the damp maintenance tunnel. I navigated the narrow utility passage quickly, my boots splashing in the shallow puddles of water that had collected along the concrete floor. The air down here was cold and smelled of rust, damp earth, and ozone. I reached the reinforced steel door, turned my brass key, and stepped into the warm sub-basement. I moved like a shadow through the corridors, making no sound as I walked toward the server room. I approached the biometric scanner, placed my hand on the glass, and aligned my eye with the lens. The deadbolts retracted with a heavy clack, and I stepped into the freezing server rooms, surrounded by the flashing lights of the server racks. I sat at the central console, plugged in the encrypted drive, and booted up the mainframe terminal. It was exactly 10:45 p.m. I opened the registry database and uploaded the signed declaration of executive revocation. I typed in the biometric confirmation code, authorizing the system update. Executive revocation authorized, the screen read. CEO access revoked. Treasury Bank notified. Outgoing wires suspended. I had executed the poison pill protocol. Zachary was no longer the CEO of Crawford Commercial HVAC. His digital keys were deactivated, and all outgoing financial transfers were frozen. I opened a secondary window to monitor the network traffic from the executive suite on the top floor. I wanted to see the moment he realized his plan was dead. At 10:55 p.m., I saw a digital connection established from Zachary's office computer. He was online, preparing the $12 million wire transfer to the Cayman Islands. I watched the data packets transmit across the bridge. He was entering the Georgetown bank coordinates, the SWIFT codes, and the compliance numbers, thinking he was siphoning the last remaining cash from the company reserves. At exactly 11 p.m., the system captured his execution command. Zachary had clicked the transfer button. On my screen, I watched the transaction hit the gateway, but instead of routing to the Federal Reserve network, the transaction was intercepted by the master lockout protocol. The mainframe matched his access key against the updated registry and flagged the transaction. Transaction declined, the system logged. Authorization revoked. Security freeze active. Upstairs, Zachary was likely staring at a frozen screen. I opened the audio bug under his desk and put on the headphones. The sound of his frantic typing came through, his fingers slamming into the keys with increasing force. What is going on? Zachary muttered, his voice sounding tense and frustrated. Why is the screen frozen? Julianne, look at this. The terminal is saying authorization revoked. It is not letting me execute the transfer. The progress bar is gone. Try it again. Julianne's voice came through, sounding sharp, demanding, and angry. Did you enter the password correctly? We don't have time for system glitches, Zachary. The Cayman Bank needs the confirmation number right now, or they won't credit the Bahamas account, and the lenders will start foreclosure on the Cleveland warehouse. I did enter it, Zachary said, his voice rising in panic. I am typing the code, but the keyboard is locked. It is not accepting my badge. The scanner on the side of the monitor is flashing red. Julianne, the whole system is shutting down. The network connection is lost. My email has been deactivated, and I cannot access the server logs. Everything is frozen. Call the IT department, she demanded, her voice rising in frustration. There is nobody in the building at 11 p.m., Zachary shouted, his voice cracking. And my corporate phone has no dial tone. The line is dead. I am trying to log in from my tablet, but the screen says my administrative account has been suspended by the chairman of the board. That is my father's title. He has blocked my digital access keys. He has locked us out of the system. That is impossible, Julianne said, her voice shaking. He has no access to the system. He is an old man with a frozen account. He doesn't even know how to use the network. He hasn't touched the servers in a decade. He built the network. Julianne, Zachary wailed, his voice filled with fear. The screen is showing the executive revocation notice. It says his signature was verified by biometric scan in the server room. He is in the building. He is doing this right now. He is locking us out. Go down to the server room, Julianne ordered. Find him and get the keys. He cannot stop this transfer. We have the court order. We can call the police and have him removed for trespassing. I am going, Zachary said, and I heard the sound of his office door slamming shut. I sat at the console in the freezing basement, watching the elevator status indicator on the screen. The executive elevator was descending, heading toward the sub-basement. I did not run and I did not hide. I simply reached out, unplugged my encrypted drive, and stored it in my coat pocket. I stood up, walked out of the server room, and locked the steel door behind me. I turned off the console screen, leaving the room in darkness. The battle was over, and Zachary had already lost. I walked back toward the maintenance tunnel, leaving him to search the dark. I climbed back out of the grate and walked back to my truck, my heart light. The wire had been stopped, and their plans were in ruins. The next morning, the winter sun broke through the gray Ohio clouds, casting a bright, cold light over the neighborhood of Upper Arlington. The streets were quiet, the snow on the lawn sparkling in the morning light. The neighborhood was one of the most exclusive areas in Columbus, lined with large brick estates and manicured lawns, all of which were now covered in a thick blanket of white slush. At exactly 8 a.m., a large, unmarked white medical van pulled into the driveway of my estate. The side of the vehicle bore the logo of Vanguard Health. Two men in blue medical scrubs stepped out of the vehicle, carrying a folder of documents and a set of heavy nylon transfer straps. They walked up the brick steps and knocked loudly on the front door. Behind them, a luxury SUV pulled up to the curb. Zachary and Julianne stepped out, their faces pale and their eyes bloodshot. They had spent the entire night trying to reach the bank, trying to contact their corporate lawyers, and trying to find me. They had failed. They looked desperate, cornered, and completely exhausted, their breath rising in white clouds in the freezing air. They had been trying to log into the servers all night but were locked out. Julianne walked up the steps, her cashmere coat wrapped tight. "Break the lock if you have to," she told the transport team. "We have the court order. He is inside and he is unstable. He locked the corporate offices last night and has been hiding in the building. He is a danger to himself and others. We have the authority as his conservators. You must take him into custody immediately." The lead transport worker nodded, reaching for a set of tools to open the lock. But before he could touch the handle, Zachary stepped forward. He reached out and turned the brass knob. The heavy door was unlocked. It swung open, revealing the quiet, warm foyer. "Dad?" Zachary called out, his voice sounding thin and hollow in the large entryway. "Dad, we are coming in. We have the medical team with us. We need to talk to you. Please don't make this difficult." They stepped inside, the transport workers following behind with the folder of commitment papers. The house was quiet, the silence heavy, cold, and absolute. Julianne led the way into the kitchen, her eyes scanning the granite counters and the stainless steel appliances. She was looking for the old man she had planned to cage, but the kitchen was empty. There was no coffee brewing, no fire in the grate, and no sign of life. The house felt like a museum, cold and abandoned. The silence in the house was deafening, the only sound being the ticking of the clock in the hall. "Where is he?" Julianne hissed, looking at Zachary. "He has to be here." His truck was not in the garage, but he could have taken a taxi. "Check the bedrooms. We have the order, and we need to get him to Pinehurst. We have to get this finished before the banks open. If he goes to the police, it will complicate the transfer of the funds." Zachary walked toward the sitting room, but as he passed the kitchen island, he stopped. His eyes locked onto a single, thick manila folder resting in the center of the dark granite counter. The folder was labeled Zachary and Julianne in clear black block letters. Zachary reached out, his hand shaking, and picked up the folder. He opened it, and Julianne walked over, looking over his shoulder. The transport workers stood in the foyer, waiting for instructions. The first page in the folder was a photocopy of the deed to the Upper Arlington estate. Daniel Miller had circled the signature on the bottom line, the exact forgery Zachary had used to transfer the property 3 weeks ago. Next to the signature, printed in bold red letters, was the legal citation. Ohio Revised Code Section 2914, 31, Forgery of Deed, Void ab initio. The second page was a copy of the emergency stay signed by the probate judge at midnight, vacating the conservatorship order and restoring all my personal assets and corporate authority. The stay cited evidence of fraudulent medical documentation and elder financial abuse. The third page was a copy of the forensic medical report on Dr. Edward Crane, detailing the $50,000 cash payment and the fake dementia affidavit. The fourth page was a printed transcript of the audio recording from Zachary's office, showing the conversation where Julianne admitted they paid the doctor to sign the paper and planned to commit me to Pinehurst Retreat to steal the money. Zachary's knees buckled, and he leaned against the kitchen counter for support, the folder slipping from his fingers. The documents scattered across the granite, the evidence of his crimes exposed. He has everything," Zachary whispered, his voice cracking as he began to tremble. "The forgery, the recording, the stay, it is all here. He knew everything we were doing. He has blocked us completely. We are finished. There is no way out of this." "This is impossible," Julianne said, her voice rising in a shrill panic as she grabbed the papers. "How did he get this? Who recorded us?" He bugged the office. He has been listening to us this entire time. He was in the office last night while we were planning the transfer." "We have to go," Zachary wailed, grabbing her arm. "The flights leave at 2. We have to get to the airport right now. We can still take the personal cash from the safe in the office and leave the country. We can go to Switzerland and hide." "You are not going anywhere, Zachary." A cold, loud voice came from the front door. Zachary and Julianne spun around. The foyer was no longer empty. 3 men in dark suits and yellow windbreakers bearing the letters FBI had stepped inside, their badges displayed. Behind them, 2 local police officers stood with their hands on their holsters. The Vanguard Health Transport team stepped back, raising their hands. The trap had closed and there was no way out. The lead FBI agent, a tall man with sharp eyes, walked into the kitchen, his badge held high. "Zachary Vance? Julianne Vance? I am Agent Harris with the White Collar Crime Division. We have warrants for your arrest, issued by the Federal District Court." Zachary stood frozen, his eyes wide and blank, his breath coming in short gasps. Julianne tried to step back, but the police officers moved in, blocking her exit toward the rear patio doors. "On what charges?" Julianne demanded, trying to project a confidence she no longer possessed. "We have a court-ordered conservatorship. We are the legal guardians of Matthew Vance. This is a family matter, and you have no right to enter this house without our permission. Our lawyer will have you removed for harassment. You have no legal standing to interfere. The conservatorship was vacated by Judge Vance at midnight," Agent Harris said, his voice flat and professional. "You are charged with federal bank fraud, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, identity fraud under ORC, Section 291349, and forgery of a deed under ORC Section 291331. We also have warrants for Dr. Edward Crane, who was arrested at his office 30 minutes ago and is currently cooperating with our agents. He has already signed a confession detailing the entire transaction. He admitted that you paid him the bribe to write the false diagnosis and that he knew Matt Vance was completely healthy. He has turned over the logs of your meetings. Crane is arrested? Zachary whispered, his face turning gray. He looked like he was about to vomit. He is. Harris nodded. He has already confirmed the receipt of the $50,000 bribe to falsify the medical documents. We have the transaction records showing the cash withdrawal from the trust account you set up, using the forged power of attorney. We also have the audio recordings of your conversations in the executive suite, confirming the conspiracy to commit Matt Vance to a psychiatric facility against his will. The evidence is complete and legally obtained under a federal warrant. You are facing up to 20 years in federal prison, and the prosecutor is not looking to negotiate. Julianne looked at Zachary, her eyes filled with rage and betrayal. You said the doctor was safe. You said the compliance officers wouldn't look at the cash withdrawals. You told me you had handled it. You are a coward and a fool. I should have never trusted you to manage the details. Shut up, Julianne, Zachary shouted, his voice cracking as he began to weep. Just shut up. It is over. We are going to prison. It is all your fault. You were the one who wanted the house. You were the one who wanted the Swiss accounts. I never wanted to lock my dad away. I never wanted to do this to him. You pushed me into this. You told me he was getting old and didn't need the money anymore. You made me do this. The police officers stepped forward, pulled Zachary's arms behind his back, and clicked the metal handcuffs around his wrists. He did not fight. He collapsed onto the kitchen floor, sobbing and begging for his father. Julianne struggled for a moment as the cuffs were placed on her wrists, her designer coat slipping from her shoulders. She hissed at the officers, but they ignored her, leading her toward the door. You can explain it to the federal prosecutor, Agent Harris said, turning to his team. Secure the documents on the counter. Search the house for any financial records, laptops, or offshore coordinates. We need the Swiss account numbers and the transfer records. Check the home office and the safe. Make sure we have everything. The forensic team will be here in 10 minutes to analyze the devices. The officers led them out of the house. Zachary was weeping, his head bowed, while Julianne kept her face covered, trying to avoid the gaze of the neighbors who had gathered on the street to watch the scene. The white medical van from Vanguard Health was ordered to leave, the workers cooperative and embarrassed to have been involved in a criminal conspiracy. They realized they had been used as pawns in a family dispute. The house Diane and I had built, the home where we had raised our son and hoped to spend our retirement, was suddenly a crime scene, filled with agents cataloging the evidence of a family's ruin. I had spent 20 years in that house, and now it was a monument to betrayal. At the same time, 5 blocks away, local police were securing the corporate offices of Crawford Commercial HVAC. They had served the revocation notice to the security team and were securing the digital files, ensuring that Zachary's shell companies were permanently shut down. The corporate bank accounts were frozen, protected by the bank under Lawrence Fletcher's direction. The $12 million reserve was safe, and the Cincinnati and Toledo warehouses remained in the company's name. The forged deeds declared void ab initio. The company would survive. The jobs of the 300 employees were secure. But the family was gone, shattered by the greed that had grown in the shadow of our success. The empire Diane and I built remained, but the son we had loved was heading to a maximum security prison. I had saved the business, but I had lost my son. Yet, as I drove away from the state, I knew I had made the only choice a man of integrity could make. I had refused to be buried in the dark. I had chosen truth over comfortable lies. I had saved the livelihoods of the families who built Crawford Commercial HVAC with me, and that was the only victory that mattered. I stood by the window, watching the cold snow drift down over the frozen asphalt, remembering how Diane and I used to dream of a quiet life. Every single dollar in our corporate reserve was a testament to the sweat, blood, and tears we had poured into the company for over 4 decades. Zachary was my only son, but he had allowed Julianne's greed to poison his heart and blind him to the values of hard work and integrity. The heavy wheels of my vintage Ford pickup truck devoured the long stretches of black asphalt as I merged onto Interstate 77. It was exactly 8:15 in the morning. I was steadily driving south, leaving the freezing, miserable winter storms of Ohio behind me, eager to embrace the warmth of the southern states. My destination was the sunny coast of South Carolina, a place where the cold wind of betrayal could not reach my bones. The heater in my truck was blowing warm air, and the V8 engine hummed with a reliable strength that felt like an old friend. The road took me through the winding mountain passes of West Virginia, where the snow-covered pine trees stood like silent witnesses along the highway. The physical transition from the cold north to the warm south mirrored the release of the tension I had carried for weeks. As I crossed the state line into Virginia and then North Carolina, the gray winter sky slowly began to clear, replaced by a soft, pale blue that felt like a promise of new beginnings. The air coming through the vents smelled fresher, cleaner, and free of the corporate stress. I could feel the cold grip of Ohio fading from my shoulders, replaced by the gentle warmth of the southern sun. Inside the quiet cabin of the truck, the only sound was the steady, rhythmic hum of the V8 engine carrying me toward my new life. I felt a profound sense of peace settling deep into my chest. The suffocating weight of my corporate empire was gone, replaced by a simple, pure sense of freedom. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing ringtone shattered the morning silence. The sound came from the cheap, plastic burner phone resting on the passenger seat. I had purchased the disposable device with cash just hours before I departed, strictly for this moment. I reached over, picked up the phone, and pressed the green button. I lifted it to my ear without saying a word. "Dad, what did you do?" Zachary screamed through the speaker, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated panic. I listened to the sound of his entire world collapsing. He was audibly hyperventilating, struggling to pull oxygen into his lungs. The arrogant, composed CEO who had planned my permanent medical incarceration was gone. In his place was a terrified, weeping child who realized he had stepped into a trap. "The money is gone," Zachary wailed, his voice ascending into a frantic shriek. I tried to execute the Cayman wire, but the account was locked. Then I checked my personal accounts, and the bank says my balance is zero. "We have nothing left, Dad." The FBI is currently swarming the lobby of the headquarters with federal warrants. They are seizing all the hard drives. Julianne and I are in the back of a police car. They are arresting us for forgery and conspiracy. "You have to help me, Dad. You have to call the lawyers and tell them it was a misunderstanding." "Please, Dad, you can't let them take us. We have nothing. They are taking us to the county jail. We are going to lose everything." Julianne is hysterical. I kept my eyes locked on the long gray highway stretching out before me, refusing to let his tears penetrate my emotional armor. I did not raise my voice, and I did not match his frantic energy. I spoke with the cold, absolute calm of a man who had reclaimed his soul from the dark. "You explicitly told me to stop wasting your money, Zachary," I replied, letting the cold reality of my words pierce through his sobbing. "I did exactly that. I secured the funds, exposed your medical conspiracy, and handed your illegal cryptocurrency ledgers directly to the federal government. I am simply honoring your request to step aside. Enjoy your bankruptcy, son." "Dad, please!" Zachary shrieked, his voice sounding desperate and small. "Julianne is screaming at me, and the police are saying we are facing 10 years. You can't do this to me. I am your son. I made a mistake. I was just listening to her. I didn't want to hurt you. My son died when he forged my signature to steal his mother's house under ORC Section 291331, I said, my voice steady. My son died when he paid a doctor to lock me in an asylum under ORC Section 291349. You are just a stranger wearing his face. I have nothing more to say to you. You made your choice, and now you must live with the consequences. You wanted my money, and now you have the price of it." I pressed the end button, permanently severing the connection before he could utter another word. I grasped the cheap plastic burner phone tightly in both hands and snapped the device in half. I rolled down the driver's side window, letting the fresh Carolina air whip into the cabin. I tossed the shattered pieces of plastic out onto the highway shoulder, watching them bounce and scatter into the gravel and dust of the roadside. The early southern sun crested over the distant horizon, casting brilliant rays of golden light across my windshield. The warm light bathed my face, melting away the remaining chill of the nightmare I had escaped. I pressed my foot heavily on the accelerator, driving into absolute freedom. I had stripped myself of my corporate title and my wealth, but I had preserved the only thing that mattered. I had defended my sovereignty, my mind, and my dignity against those who sought to bury me. I was finally completely free. I stood by the window, watching the cold snow drift down over the frozen asphalt, remembering how Diane and I used to dream of a quiet life. Every single dollar in our corporate reserve was a testament to the sweat, blood, and tears we had poured into the company for over 4 decades. Zachary was my only son, but he had allowed Julian's greed to poison his heart and blind him to the values of hard work and integrity. The wind in Columbus was freezing and relentless, a harsh reminder of the bitter struggles I had faced when I first started the business. Looking back on the long road that brought me to the Carolina coast, I realized the greatest mistake I made was believing that love alone could protect a family. It cannot. Love without wisdom and boundaries can easily become permission for greed to grow. If my journey teaches anything to the next generation, it is this. Never sacrifice your dignity to keep peace with people who no longer value your presence or respect your labor. Real family justice begins when you choose truth over comfort, even when that truth is painful. Many people expect revenge stories to end with anger and bitterness. But as I sit on the porch of my new, modest home near the ocean, listening to the waves crash against the shore, I have discovered something different. The greatest victory was not watching my son lose everything. It was refusing to lose myself. It was preserving the integrity of my mind and the memory of the woman who helped me build everything. Family justice isn't about destroying those who betray you. It is about protecting your values, your future, and the people who still deserve your love. If you are raising children or building something for the next generation, leave them more than money. Leave them integrity, responsibility, and the example of a person who knew when to stand firm. Wealth can disappear overnight, but character lasts far longer. Every family revenge story reminds us that respect must be earned, never demanded through fear or entitlement. My son believed he owned my life because he had my blood. He was wrong. The blood in our veins only makes us relatives. It is our actions and respect that make us family. I have started a new chapter here in South Carolina. I don't have the $40 million corporate empire anymore, and I don't live in the Upper Arlington brick estate. I left the company's daily operation to a trust managed by Lawrence Fletcher and Daniel Miller, ensuring that the 300 employees are protected and that the business continues to serve the community honestly. The profits are directed to St. Luke's Community Church and other charities Diane loved. I kept only a modest retirement fund, enough to live simply and comfortably. I spend my mornings walking along the beach, breathing in the salt air, and working on old truck engines in my new garage. Timothy Benson sent me a letter last week, letting me know that my green 1978 Ford pickup is still the talk of his shop. He said the truck is running better than ever, and he is proud to keep it maintained. Daniel Miller visits me once a month, and we spend our afternoons fishing and talking about the old days. He told me that Zachary and Julianne have both pleaded guilty to the federal charges and are serving 8 years in a federal penitentiary. Dr. Edward Crane lost his medical license and is serving 3 years. It is a sad end for them, but it is the price of their choices. They chose greed, and the law has held them accountable. I live in a small wooden cottage with a view of the marshes and the ocean. The air is always warm and smells of salt and pine. I have made a few friends here, mostly other retirees and local fishermen. They don't know me as a millionaire or a corporate chairman. They just know me as Matt, the guy who drives the old green truck and knows how to fix a carburetor. And that is exactly how I want it. I have realized that the true value of life is not in the assets you accumulate, but in the peace of mind you possess. Zachary believed that money would buy him freedom and respect, but it only bought him a cell. Julianne believed designer labels and country clubs would make her superior, but she is now wearing a prison uniform. They built their lives on the shifting sands of greed, while Diane and I built ours on the solid rock of hard work. I'd truly like to hear your thoughts on this journey. What would you have done if someone you trusted betrayed everything you built? Leave a comment below and share your own experiences. Share this story with someone who may need to hear it, and subscribe if you enjoy stories about family justice and revenge. Your support means more than you know. One final note for the listeners. Upcoming stories on this channel will include some fictional elements created for educational and storytelling purposes. If that isn't the type of content you are looking for, feel free to explore other stories that better match your interests. Family justice always begins with choosing truth over silence. Thank you for walking this long journey with me until the very end. Stay strong and stand firm. I stood by the window, watching the cold snow drift down over the frozen asphalt, remembering how Diane and I used to dream of a quiet life. Every single dollar in our corporate reserve was a testament to the sweat, blood, and tears we had poured into the company for over 4 decades. Zachary was my only son, but he had allowed Julianne's greed to poison his heart and blind him to the values of hard work and integrity. The wind in Columbus was freezing and relentless, a harsh reminder of the bitter struggles I had faced when I first started the business. Tim Benson's shop was a humble place, a small sanctuary of honest work where a man could talk about steel and engines without any lies. Daniel Miller had been my attorney and friend for 30 years, and I trusted his sharp legal mind more than anyone else in the city. The Upper Arlington estate had once been filled with laughter and warmth, but without Diane, it felt like a silent museum of past memories. Crawford Commercial HVAC was not just a company to me. It was the physical proof of a life spent building something that would last. The V8 engine of my 1978 Ford pickup truck roared to life, a familiar and grounding rumble that always reminded me of my true roots.